Before we get to the quatre quarts cake, I have a couple things to say. So, thank you for a wonderful morning, number one. Number two, thank you, Erin and David, so much. Part of our team. And to everyone from Heritage who is working so hard to make this successful. Every one of you, we appreciate what you're doing. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Now, I'm in my Reginald Marsh mode again, and I was standing in line for the ladies' room, and I was asked by someone who's deeply interested in what we do, if I were to give you a donation, would that go toward the challenge? And I'm going to take the liberty of sharing the essence of something that Marty shared with me, and which I believe, which is what we are trying to do is sustain the American art community. And that means if you want to support, it's not that you must, but if you want to support, the fact that you support is as important as how much you give. Because the idea here is to create something in which so many people participate, that participation is part of the success, so that in this broad inquiry about every aspect of American art, including actually what we mean by that term, we cannot fail. And in that process, we sustain inquiry and allow all viewpoints to be shared, and also ensure the fact that there is never a period in time when our art is going to be thought of as someone's sculpture garden. So I hope that's an answer to the question. We welcome all support. We are deeply, deeply grateful for those who do support, and you make it possible. And trust me, world domination is the goal. So now, maybe too much about me, but I'm just going to tell you. In the summer of 1995, it was July, and I had on a short sleeve, a red print silk dress, and I was 7 months pregnant. And I went to meet with Suzanne Smeaton at Eli Wellner. And I will tell you that meeting changed my life. The incredible generosity of spirit, the sense of adventuresome embrace of the frame, the generosity, and also, frankly, helping me think about something I hadn't before. But that meeting happened then. Shortly thereafter, but I think I wasn't pregnant anymore, I had been introduced to Tracy by phone and Simeon Lagodich. So it's Gill and Lagodich, two people. He's also a painter. And so I came to know Gill and Lagodich and got a whole package of information and started to be introduced to that. Then attention was also called to David Mandel, who happens to be here, and the House of Heidenreich. Very, very interesting, important work. He has spoken before. Don't worry, it will happen again. What I want to say to you is this, that during those years, Jesus Christ, I sound like, whatever, but it's true. During those years, there was an awakening of interest in something that has periodically been interesting beyond just the small corners in which the discussions take place. But it really was a transformative period when people really started to think about, oh my gosh, what what does the edge mean? What is the transformative power of the frame? How do you restore the frame, which is something, for example, that Gill and Lagodich have been, amazing with. Really mind expanding. And one of the things that is so great about, I'll just say, frame studies is the multiplicity of perspectives that are meaningful. So it is a conversation that involves everybody. You may be the owner. Do you have the right to decide? Does the dead artist decide? Who decides? That's just one tiny, it's a huge question, but that's one of many, many questions. So this is by virtue of introducing something that I think is incredibly important, because you could argue, which I have and will, that in a way the beginning of the modern is when a distinct frame started to exist. I'm super thrilled to introduce this section called The Transformative Power of the Frame. We added in American art. Yes, it's true in American art. It's true, period. The transformative power of the frame. And we have 4 exceptional people to talk about this topic, and I may chime in. But in order of the way they're going to speak is Jennifer Thompson, who's here from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, an absolutely incredible conversation about cassette and frame choices. And that's great because it also links Europe and the States, if you will. Then Tracy Gill from Gill and Lagodich, and she is going to talk about Prendergast and frames that are just breathtaking, also incredibly important. Then, and because this is really important, is that there is an ongoing concern that artists have with the frame. And so we have Stephanie Tema. Is it Hier? Okay, this articulating is different from reading. So, and she has just come back from the Arctic, where she was on an artistic exploration or retreat. So we are her first, as they say in Vampire Land, warm bloods. So, and her work is very involved with both what's in and what might be considered the surround. And then who will moderate and all the rest of it illuminate is Suzanne Smeaton. And I call her Zahn. One thing to remember, I will tell you that I also learned in 1995, which is, it is Suzanne, as in Cezanne. And she is a pioneer, really, in American frame scholarship. I am always honored to collaborate with her, and I can't tell you how fantastic this opportunity is. So over to them.
All right. Well, great. Thank you. Let's get started. In April 1879, Mary Cassatt exhibited 11 works. They included 7 oil paintings, 3 pastels, and 1 distemper in the 4th Impressionist exhibition. And stakes were high for the 35-year-old artist. She was breaking from the salon for the first time and embarking on an unconventional path for a well-to-do Philadelphia woman. She would, of course, be the only American artist invited to join the Impressionists. And I'm showing you on the screen here 8 of the works from that exhibition that we've been able to identify. The other 3 are still the subject of quite a bit of debate. But in this moment, in the spring of 1879, Cassatt was determined to be taken seriously as an artist and as a professional artist. And her father had told her 4 months earlier that her art had to pay for itself. And I know there was a little bit of talk this morning about her art, her work being, her life being subsidized by her elder brother, Alexander. I think Mary might take offense at that and be very clear that, in fact, she bought her country house with the proceeds from her art and that she had to pay her studio rent, her model fees, her artist materials, and indeed her frames. But in the fourth Impressionist exhibition, her works were shown together in room 3. She seems to have had the room to herself. And that year, the exhibition was held in very elegant spaces on the first floor of a newly constructed residential building that was in the fashionable area around the opera. And fortunately for Cassatt, the critical reception of her works was generally quite favorable. Her father would even write home that she began to tire of her success. And I will just share sort of one representative sort of statement made by a critic. The work by this bold painter that has most impressed visitors is a young red-headed woman in a theater box, the back wall of which is a mirror reflecting the brilliantly lit theater. This work suggests the flesh has been modeled by reflections, clearly revealing a very individual talent. And the same reviewer would go on to note that her works were very cleverly framed. Unfortunately, other reviewers were less enamored with her frames. Another one would write, Mary Cassatt has had the delicate intention of surrounding her victim in a wooden frame painted green. Edmond Renoir, younger brother of the Impressionist Renoir, would write that Cassatt's frames were smeared with red and green, which are truly ugly and in the worst taste. Regrettably for us, none of Cassatt's frames from this exhibition have survived. And there's actually very little in her correspondence that sheds any light on her framing decisions or even the logistics behind these colored frames. We can begin to guess, though, that she was interested in building this sort of sense of a complementary color contrast, since we know that from the review that this work, the victim in this painting, was surrounded by a green frame. And there's another, sort of one annotated catalog helps us to recognize, or tells us that the woman with a fan on the upper row on the far right was in a vermilion frame. We might also imagine that with these frames that were colored, Cassatt was intent on signaling the modernity of her approach, signaling that she was doing something quite different with these works. I also suspect she was quite interested in the environment in which the viewer would encounter these paintings. And Martha Ward has pointed out that Cassatt and her peers were particularly concerned right at this moment in how their exhibitions looked and in creating apartment-like spaces to show their paintings. And of course, it's often been remarked that Impressionist paintings are domestically scaled works. And so in these, the artists are often hanging them in single rows or maybe double hanging them on neutral wall colors. So in many respects, I think we would all feel at home in an Impressionist exhibition because it looks not unlike our museums or our art galleries today. We know that Cassatt was not alone in her attention to frames. In 1877, just prior Impressionist exhibition, Pissarro had exhibited 22 works in white frames, and he quite deliberately stated that the white frames helped bring out the colors inside his paintings. Following the 1879 exhibition, white and colored frames proliferated. Many artists sort of jumped onto this bandwagon, so to speak, and the wall colors in 1880 were lilac, antique red, and yellow. You might imagine Camille Pissarro's prints with yellow mats in purple frames. So it gives you a sense of where the artist took this, and really thinking about the harmonies between their works and the environment and the room in which the paintings and pastels are being seen. And of course, many 19th century artists were paying attention to the 1839 work of the French chemist and scientist Michel Eugène Chavreau, who wrote, it's a very long title, I'm not going to give it all to you, but it starts out, he wrote a volume titled The Laws of Contrast of Color and Their Application to the Arts of Painting, Decoration of Buildings, Mosaic Work, Tapestry, etc., etc. The book volume included over 600 different laws or principles of how you might apply color. Cassatt might have paid a special attention to law number 448, which stated that gilt frames accord well with large pictures in oil when the latter do not represent gildings. And what's notable to me is that many of Cassatt's exhibition pieces in 1879 actually depict, say, the gilt interiors of an opera and the like. So that might be yet another reason for her to turn away from gold frames. In 1978, the Cassatt painting was given to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in this Louis-style frame. And I'll just quickly run through the provenance of this picture, and maybe later on we can ask for people's opinions on who might have taken off that green frame. The painting was acquired right around the time of the Impressionist exhibition by the Parisian collector Alex Rouault. It would descend through that family for a number of generations, belonging at one point to the father-in-law of Julie Manet, Berthe Morisot's daughter. It was sold in the late 1940s and acquired by another Parisian collector, Marcel Midi of Paris. He sold it to Wildenstein Gallery in 1966, and that very year, they sold the painting to the Philadelphia collectors, Charlotte Dorrance Wright and William Cox Wright, who gave it to the museum in this frame. In 1998, the exhibition catalog for a very significant Cassatt retrospective in Chicago, Boston, and Washington included a mock-up of what Cassatt's painting might have looked like in a green frame. This mock-up was produced by Stephen Starling of the Art Institute of Chicago, who imagined the painting in a Degas-style frame and selecting a green. If we fast forward to 2022, 2023, as we began planning the Mary Cassatt at Work exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we undertook a technical study of all of 84 works by Cassatt in the museum's collection. So we had the great pleasure for about a year and a half of having all of her paintings and pastels out of their frames and in our conservation studios. I have to confess, we got rather used to not having them in their frames, and there was a different kind of liberation that came about from unframing them. But we decided at that moment to take the Chicago experiment even further and to create a green frame for our painting. We knew from the onset that it would be sort of a best guess, that we didn't have enough material about Cassatt's original frame. We could make very informed choices, but that whatever we did, it was very clearly going to be a 2023 product. But where to start? Edgar Degas and Mary Cassatt were at their very closest in the 1870s. They were in and out of each other's studios. He was regularly at dinner with the Cassatt family. Gossip that he would bring from the Parisian art world would be written back to Cassatt's family in Philadelphia. We know that he helped her select the 11 works that she showed in the Impressionist exhibition because he wrote their titles down in his notebook, 1 or 2 pages away from where he made his own list of works that he was exhibiting. So I think it seems entirely reasonable that she might have gone to him for advice on framing. And of course, there is a sizable body of scholarship on Degas' frames, which have proved endlessly useful to us by people like Peter Mallow, Elizabeth Easton, Jared Bark, Isabel Kahn, and others. And it's really their work that has highlighted 2 Degas pastels from 1879 and 1880, respectively, both of which are believed to retain their original frames. The pastel on the left of two friends backstage has a kind of fluted cushion. It's a little hard to see in a image flat when you're looking flat on at the frame, but it had a sort of pillowy shape to the frame. The one on the right, the bather lying on the floor, has what's sometimes called a coxcomb or fan-like shape. We sent the museum's conservation framer, Christopher Ferguson, to the Musée d'Orsay to study both of these frame profiles, take sort of dimensions, and also to do his best to color match the surfaces of these frames. And in the end, we made just a kind of group choice, but one that was unanimous, to pursue using this profile, which is that coxcomb or fan-like profile for our new frame. So Chris made a wooden structure for it, and then applied the pâte coulante, which is a kind of flowing paste made of plaster, chalk, and gesso, which gets applied over the wood structure with a scraper. We were deeply indebted to Peter Mallow's article that showed how that could be done. And that sort of got us to here, which is the sort of pâte coulante surface. I hope these images give you a little bit of sense of the shape of and the way that the frame sort of comes towards you, and also is very satisfying from the side. But our next challenge was color. We started with that Orsay sort of green, which resulted in a very Loden kind of hunter green color that looked dead against the painting. We then tried to select some greens from the picture, thinking they might make sense, and they felt kind of garish, a little too bright. So you'll see some of those colors in the samples on the painting truck here to the left. And we ended up resorting to a fan deck of colors, Benjamin Moore colors, and selected a color known as rosemary sprig, which was the color that, and this is a very subjective process. It was the color that felt to us that it brought forward the pinks and the reds within the painting, and that the frame sort of served as a kind of border, a boundary from a transition, as you will, from what's around the painting, but really started to focus your eye into Cassatt's subject without perhaps being distracting. And I like to do this compare and contrast. Of course, the very straight lines of the new frame sort of don't have that ornament in the corners or in the center. They also don't fight with the red color of her hair as much. And in a picture in which Cassatt was really exploring color, but also exploring reflections on a variety of surfaces, taking, I think, a reflective gold frame out of the equation has seemingly helped. I will say that when we showed the painting in this frame in the exhibition, I would often ask people for their opinion. And we had on the label, and we did identify the frame on the label as a 2023 interpretation of what Cassatt's original frame might have looked like. And then we included an image of what it looked like in the gold frame. And people were divided 50-50 as to whether we should keep the green frame on, or we should put the gold frame back on after the exhibition. And that is a very interesting topic in itself. A couple of weeks before we opened the exhibition in May of last year, we brought the painting into the conservation studio to remove the varnish. And there was a paper tape that was just surrounding the edge of the canvas, which is something that an earlier restorer who'd lined the canvas had done to just kind of neaten up the edges. And we decided to pull that off because one of our goals was to really study Cassatt's practices, understand her material and the like. And in doing so, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, but I'm just going to point it out here. We had covered a very thin green line that was just at the upper right corner of the canvas. And we speculate that something may have happened to the edge of the frame in that corner, requiring it to be touched up, and that someone made the decision to do that touch-up work with the painting inside the frame. We got kind of chills when we unveiled this, or when my conservation colleague called me and said, "You've got to come down and see this. You're not going to believe it." Because the green is extremely close to rosemary sprig. It's not a perfect match. It's slightly bluer here, but we felt a little relieved that we'd picked a green that felt like it was where Cassatt might have landed. And in a sort of as a sort of maybe conclusion or postscript, Cassatt doesn't seem to have taken or returned to this experiment again. We know, for instance, that she didn't pick up colored frames the next time she exhibits with the Impressionists in 1880. And in fact, she virtually never talks about frames in any of her correspondence, except to say things like, "I'm going off to the frame maker," but not giving us any clues as to who that might be or what she's doing. We did, however, in our research, come across, as we were looking at other of Cassatt's works, we did come across another frame that we might think of as being an original frame. Cassatt's correspondence regarding this picture is quite clear and definitive. She finished this work, we know, on Saturday, July 11th, 1896, and she sent it immediately to Paul Durand-Ruel, her dealer in Paris. She wrote to him 3 days later, "I was extremely persistent with this, perhaps too much. But since I only finished it on Saturday, I'm counting on it settling as it improves." We're not quite sure what she meant by being persistent about it. Maybe it was the way that she worked up the greens or scraped down areas of the canvas. But the fact that she finished it only on Saturday and sent it off to him sort of gave us some excitement when, on unframing the work, we discovered that there were green paint had transferred from Cassatt's canvas onto the backside of the rabbet of this frame, telling us that in fact Durand-Ruel was quite eager to frame it up. And then that indicates that this is the first frame that was on the work, and that in sending it to Durand-Ruel, Cassatt may very well have left the framing decisions to him. And I wonder if Cassatt, who occupies this very unique position in the world of French artists and the sort of avant-garde world of art at the time, she also had another foot into the world of collectors and played a pivotal role in sort of helping to encourage Americans and others to acquire Impressionist pictures. And so I wonder if she decided to throw her energies into changing tastes and encouraging collectors to acquire the new painting that was coming out of Paris, and in turn deciding that she would not worry so much about frames, knowing that in fact the decision about frames for many of these collectors would also involve pretty substantial interior decoration questions. On that note, I'll turn to my colleagues on this panel, who I suspect will raise similar issues.
Yeah. Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Zahn, for moderating our frame conversation. And thank you, Lisa, for the invitation to share thoughts on the transformative power of the American frame. In keeping with the conference theme, Crafting the Dream, I chose to focus on the iconoclastic artist framemaker Charles Prendergast, my all-time favorite, who happened to craft a frame with the word dream carved right on it. This elaborate work of art frame was hand-carved and gilded in 1903, at a time when America was just emerging from the frenetic 19th century emphasis on machine-made commercial production and just beginning to rediscover its rich heritage in applied arts. The frame is signed by both Charles and his older brother, Maurice Prendergast, indicating that they both considered it a work of art rather than furniture for a painting. Although both men were already dabbling in frame making, the 1903 Dreamwald Commission really confirmed for Charles that he could make a living as an artist frame maker and do it his own way with a creative freedom that would keep him happy and employed as an artist craftsman. Moving forward, we'll see how Prendergast frames, like their paintings, are so very original and mark the advent of modernity in American art and changed the course of American frame making. Though I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Prendergast brothers, a quick overview. Charles was a woodworker, frame maker, craftsman years before he called himself an artist. Maurice was always an impoverished artist who made his earliest frames out of necessity to exhibit his own paintings. Maurice Prendergast is widely considered the first American modernist, one of the first Americans to embrace the work of Cezanne and Matisse. His flattened forms, jewel-tone colors, and mosaic-like compositions also cast him as America's most distinctive post-impressionist. A 1946 New Yorker magazine article stated, "He studied in Paris in the late 1890s and was considerably influenced by Cezanne before that painter was ever heard of in this country. So his paintings for many years were looked upon here as the ravings of a pigmentary wild man." In 1908, he was one of the 8 in that historic Macbeth Gallery exhibition. And at the groundbreaking 1913 Armory show, his tapestry-like paintings, exhibited in frames carved by Charles, were decried as, quote, "an explosion in a paint factory." His work celebrated the vibrancy of people at leisure, in parks, by the sea, at play, and the playful quality of his brother's frames made companionable surrounds. While young Maurice longed to study art in Paris, from the age of 14, Charles found his greatest talent was whittling wood, though he doubted he could make a living at it. After casting about in various careers as an errand boy at Dahl and Richards Art Gallery and as a traveling salesman, he was, quote, "so damn miserable, so damn unhappy, so damn aggravated that I plain got sick of having myself around." Finally, in his early 30s, he began carving frames and got just enough commissions that he kept at it. In 1912, at nearly 50 years old, Charles turned his talents to panels and furniture in the manner of the Italian Renaissance. Using the same techniques he had on frames, primarily incised gesso, tempera paint, and gilding, he also espoused flattened compositions and bright colors. While Maurice's watercolors sparkled with the white of the paper, Charles's panels glowed with passages of gold and silver leaf. The modern patterning of both brothers' artwork extended right to the frame and sometimes onto it. So what was Dreamwald? In 1901, financial wizard Thomas W. Lawson began planning a 350-acre estate in Egypt, Massachusetts. A Boston stock market speculator and co-founder of Amalgamated Copper, he was known as the Copper King. He named his estate Dreamwald and chose as his emblem the winged horse Pegasus, held by the strong hand of man. Lawson's story is a rag to riches and back to rags saga of the Gilded Age. He boasted many accomplishments: inventions of a baseball card game and the Lawson overstuffed sofa, author of the Lawson History of the America's Cup, and a novel entitled Friday the 13th, even a failed run for Senate. In its heyday, Lawson's so-called farm expanded to 1,000 acres and incorporated a polo field, horse racing track, breeding stables, railroad station, post office, general store, and its own fire department. There was a blacksmith shop and stables for hundreds of horses, a herd of Jersey cattle, 3,000 birds, and kennels for his champion dogs, 6 different breeds. Lawson was a cutting-edge tastemaker, commissioning the IT designers and artisans for custom fabrications related directly to his new home. His farm-themed dining room was lit by Tiffany leaded glass pumpkins, trailing cast bronze tendrils and hanging blossom wall sconces. Russell Crook andirons were cast as bears and bees to represent the stock market, one side getting the honey, the other the sting. Unique groovy tiles adorned the fireplaces, bathrooms, and the conservatory. And from Charles Prendergast, Lawson ordered 3 specially designed trophy frames. The Dreamwald frame is both a traditional trophy frame and a window into the future of American frame making, with portraits drawn right on the frame, all crowned with Lawson's signature Pegasus, representing beauty, strength, and speed. 2 European trophy frames, where the sitter is pictured in luxurious dress surrounded by symbols of his accomplishments, which are also carved and gilded onto the elaborate frame. Trophy frames are not just for royals or military heroes. The frame on the right contains a portrait of the Baroque composer George Frederick Handel and is crowned with musical instruments. This American trophy frame was commissioned by the Copper King, but the Prendergasts accomplished it with such charm and whimsy. Given free rein to create their own modern interpretations, it became thoroughly novel, a break from convention in freehand drawings around the moldings. The Dreamwald frame is a testament to its subjects, the daughters, dogs, horses, and farm that Tom Lawson loved best. Here he is with one of his prized bulldogs, and the painting he ordered in 1902 from another Boston local, famed animal painter Alexander Pope. The Dreamwald trophy frame was commissioned by one of the richest men in America, yet he did not frame a portrait of himself. Instead, 8 of his champion bulldogs, blue ribbon winners at Lawson Kennels. And in my humble opinion, the Prendergast portraits of daughters and dogs drawn on the frame are far more compelling than the canvas. Charles probably scribed the dogs, but I'm thinking Maurice may have drawn the 4 girls. Given his mastery in capturing figures at leisure, they look just like they stepped out of his sketchbooks. Considering the popular frame styles of the 19th century for Hudson River School landscapes, Barbizon style for impressive portraits and the like, Lawson giving the brothers free rein over the Dreamwald frame design is somewhat astounding. I'd mentioned there were 3 Dreamwald frames. The earliest, 1903, at top from the Gill and Lagodich collection, and below the 1908 frame in the collection of the Terra Foundation for American Art. The 3rd frame is whereabouts unknown. The Terra frame contained a portrait of 11 dogs by Alexander Pope. The painting is long gone, but the frame remains a notable work of art in itself. The 1908 portrait included spaniels as well as bulldogs, and again you can see the Prendergast's marvelous interpretation of the taller, droopy-jowled spaniels, as well as some other lovely illustrations, girls and horseshoes crowned with the Dreamwald emblem. Most importantly, the Dreamwald frames represent an inflection point between the Gilded Age to the modern in American frame making. At the tail end of the 19th century, in the world of the Prendergast brothers and their artist friends, painting exhibitions were still pretty much viewings of mass-produced frames and repetitive design. Although artists were keenly interested in frames for their paintings, selection of a carved frame would have been very rare indeed. Frame making had become big industry, and artists might pick and choose pattern or profile details, but these frames were made with cast ornament, pressed into molds, and glued to wood substrates in repeating rows. Manufacturing methods allowed for a fineness in detail that could be repeated and was more affordable than painstaking hand carving. So how did change come about? As noted, before the turn of the 20th century, Charles and Maurice Prendergast launched a radical transformation in the design and craft of the American frame. Frames no longer had to be connected to interiors or furniture. Artists wanted frames that related to their canvases, not the rooms that their patrons lived in. This is a bunch of Prendergast frames that we stacked up in our gallery. Look how different they are from the types of American frames we'd have seen just a decade or so before. Repurposing practices of early European frame construction and gilding, also noting the craftsmanship and motifs inherent in American folk art, they created a new visual vocabulary, a modern reordering of historical forms, into a new vernacular of American frames. Not only are Prendergast frames the most modern for their time, they are the most fun. A closer look at any Prendergast frame reveals individual quirks, the hand of the maker supremely evident. The ornament or drawing of the frame was the most innovative aspect, particularly those for their own use. Often loose and whimsical, almost childlike, carved in shallow relief on a simple wood molding. Primitivistic foliate forms, wing shapes, stars, and flowers would appear in unexpected places on the frame surface. Left is a Charles Prendergast gilded mirror frame from our collection, and right, polychrome in the Williams College Prendergast archive. As a modern primitive artist, Charles found inspiration in reinterpretation of traditional forms. We might not think of folk art as being gilded, but here we can see it is. The visual vocabulary of American folk art, the primitive hand-carved motifs, Maurice's somewhat unsophisticated reverse glass painting, are elevated by Charles's iconoclastic following of his own vision, and on the oval frame, his love of gold. Maurice traveled to Europe and intensively studied not just Cézanne paintings, but also the frames, making detailed drawings in his notebooks, reportedly over 200 pages of frame sketches. Many frame designs were thus related to Charles via sketch, so it seems he was carving his frames a step removed from the originals, adapting from his brother's drawings or from memory of European frames in the Boston museums, rather than straight ahead copying an original antique. Charles wrote, "It's good to study the old carvers, but not to copy them." His interpretations are naive and beautifully innocent, free from the expected. He wasn't trying to repeat or duplicate early frames. He appropriated bits he liked and entirely modernized in form and placement. At right, a frame carved by Charles that reimagines European design elements. Unstructured and restructured, marvelously modern opposing C scrolls appear to float in the centers, set free from corner restraints that we see on original 17th century Venetian frames at left. The Prendergast C scrolls are inflated, and the center is a pretty posy, a stylized motif we will see on many of his frames. Another frame with C scrolls, now incised and further abstracted, but still reminiscent of Venetian forebears. To illustrate how far he had stepped away from accurate historicism, Charles's invoice to collector Albert Barnes specifies his sausage pattern. On the frame at left, he appears to have lost his pattern punch tool and continued on the other side with an ice pick, stabbing in random pattern. At right, similar motifs carved in low relief, augmented with cross-hatching and paint. Each of these frames appears as if Charles was joyfully drawing freehand with his chisel as he worked around the frame molding. Now, before we run out of time, let me introduce one more influential character in the modern American frame story. At the point in time Dreamwald was commissioned, Charles had for several years been eking out a living making frames from his home in Winchester, Massachusetts. Painter Herman Dudley Murphy, returning from studies abroad in 1897, also settled in Winchester. And by the way, Thomas Lawson was living there at the time he was building his Dreamwald estate. Murphy had become interested in frames after meeting James McNeill Whistler in Paris. On his return, he learned the basics of frame making from his neighbor, Charles Prendergast. This is a very early Murphy frame that we bought about 30 years ago at the Brimfield Flea Market. It was rescued from a chicken coop in Winchester. Note the Art Nouveau design influences and the low carat lemon gilding over red clay. This was not a combination seen in America before, and we attribute it to Murphy's admiration of Whistler, who was ordering frames in specific carats of gold to harmonize with his paintings. In 1903, Murphy and Prendergast formed the frame-making atelier of Carrigrahane, a cooperative of artisans, today considered the premier American arts and crafts makers. Note, this is a Murphy design, but you're seeing, again, the free-floating corner ornaments now floating around in centers. There isn't time to discuss more of Murphy's endeavors, but take my word, he became a very significant influence on American frames going forward. Moving later into the 20th century, American arts and crafts frames hand-carved by various makers. And very important to emphasize, these frames were commissioned by artists for artists. Hand-carved with an aesthetic that matched or complemented their paintings, colors of gilding and patinas would be different on each frame, specifically chosen for each individual canvas. The profiles were refined so as not to overshadow with large foliate or cast plaster motifs. I quote from a 1906 article, "Individual treatment of the picture frame." The first serious attempt in this country to restore the picture frame to something of its old-time honor originated one summer several years ago amongst a little colony of artists on Cape Cod. Mr. Murphy and Mr. Prendergast, both Boston painters, had conversations on the subject of framing pictures, leading to a suggestion that while theoretically every artist should attend to the making of his own frames, practically, an occasional artist, if willing to acquaint himself with the details of the craft, might properly make frames for others. Mr. Prendergast began shortly after to produce frames which have become very familiar in the exhibitions of the past 2 years. Mr. Murphy started not long after and soon became the commanding figure of the movement. Several other artists have since taken up similar lines of work, so now there's a distinct Boston group of frame makers. The artistic frame movement soon spread to New York and Pennsylvania. As each frame was a work of art, their makers proudly signed and sometimes dated on the back. By 1909, picture frames were all the rage in art world reporting. American Art News published an article entitled "Picture Framing Reform," and in the same issue, Herman Dudley Murphy ran an advertisement stating in bold caps, "The framing of a picture is as important as the painting of it." New York dealer William Clausen advertised an exhibition of artistic frames, mirrors, and modern paintings that was also mentioned in the gallery calendar listings, along with well-known art dealers such as Knoedler, Macbeth, Montrose, and Duran-Ruel. Point being that American Art News considered an exhibit of frames as worthy of announcement as an exhibit of paintings by Childe Hassam or Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema. To quote more fully, the reform in picture framing is very apparent in most exhibitions. At no time since the degradation of the frame in the middle 19th century have so good frames been designed and executed as in the past 2 or 3 years. A large frame was made for the portrait of President Roosevelt. That it should be carried out simultaneously with the production of the picture is evident of a new disposition among local painters. They are no longer content with the meaningless stereotyped stucco and composition frames of the trade. They want individual treatment. Credit for this movement in the direction of individualized picture frames belongs undoubtedly in the first instance to the artist Charles Prendergast. Mr. Prendergast was the first professional artist to open a frame shop and solicit work from other painters. A 1946 New Yorker magazine profile of Charles, interviewed just 2 years before his death, stated that crafting the Dreamwald frame was his most memorable commission. By this time, Prendergast was such a notable artist that the length of the article required the editors to publish it across 2 issues. And I quote, "Prendergast's first important commission came from T.W. Lawson, a maverick financier who wrote a sensational book, Frenzied Finance, exposing some manipulations on the New York Stock Exchange. Lawson, who operated in Boston, liked hunting dogs and kept a pack of them. One November, he decided it would be a pleasant idea to give himself an oil painting of his dogs for Christmas. He called in a local artist to round up his 30-odd hounds on a single canvas and called in Prendergast to frame the result. Lawson's only instructions were that the job must be completed by Christmas, which gave Prendergast less than a month, and that the Lawson coat of arms must appear at the top of the frame. Prendergast found the coat of arms troublesome, but with his brother's help, he finished the job on time. On Christmas Eve, the 2 brothers walked through a snowstorm to Lawson's home and delivered his dogs, his frame, and his coat of arms. On Christmas Day, out of the same snowstorm, a messenger from Lawson appeared in Winchester and delivered a check for $800. Before the new year was in, the brothers had moved to Boston. This recollection takes us full circle to the first significant commission that enabled the Prendergast brothers to move forward to the new Center of American Framemaking and further their modernity, the craft, and to work with other artists as artist framemakers, part of a larger movement in American art. This final grouping represents the Prendergast legacy, frames by the most notable American makers, from Prendergast to Foster Brothers, J.H. Miller, Frederick Harrer, and Max Cuny, who also made the gorgeous gilded and incised screen at back. To close, in keeping with the theme of this conference, a Charles Prendergast quote from a 1909 article he wrote for the House Beautiful, entitled Revival of Wood Carving. "It may be a dream, but seeing the change that all our crafts have undergone during the last 20 years, we now approach the arts of everyday life. We may be nearer the golden age of art than we imagine." Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Stephanie Hier. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm thrilled to speak with you today. And so against containment. That's sort of how I wanted to frame my work today. And I think it really sums up my ethos as an artist. As an artist, I've always been sort of in search of freedom in my work. I trained as a young artist at a traditional painting academy in Toronto, where I'm from. And then I went to college and studied painting further. And, you know, while it was my first love as an artist and what really brought me, through the art world, I kept coming up against this feeling of confinement with two dimensions, this feeling of constraint and dogma around my painting education. And so I was really looking for a way to reinvigorate the canvas for myself and make it feel like, there were no more borders. And so I came to framing really through that organic path. And so I began working in ceramic because it was a medium that I had, encountered as a child at the community center. It was something that was immediate for me. And as a self-taught sculptor, I wanted to do something that could just, open the world up for me. So these were some early works that I was making, and they were really, the frame was kind of the impetus for these works. So I started making the frame first, and then really responding to the qualities of the ceramic. They were simple frames to begin with, really bordering the canvas. And I wanted to see, how does the painting interact with its environment? What is the context that the painting exists within? I work a lot with found imagery, so I'm sourcing things from a lot of different places, and then allowing the frame to kind of continue from there. So these are some images of the frames before the canvases go into them, and there's a few reasons why I start with the frame. Firstly, there's a logistical reason. With ceramic, it shrinks a certain amount through the process of making it. So I'm custom making canvases that fit inside the ceramic. And then also I wanted to allow this sculptural practice, this ceramic practice, this practice of framing to really dictate the terms of the painting. And that really stemmed, I think, from my initial feelings of containment with painting. So allowing the my painting to respond to these various textures was really interesting to me. And also going back to these images, often I'm working in monochrome, so I'm trying to really force the two of them to exist together and feel like one object. Responding to all of the little textures and the surprise that comes through ceramic, because ceramic is such a transformational process. You as much as you try to contain it, and I do a lot of testing and all that, it just has a life of its own within within the kiln. And that's so different from painting. Painting is such a direct process. You make a mark, it's there, it doesn't change. And yeah, so it was very freeing, really, to work in ceramic in this way. And so as things progressed, I started getting even more sculptural with my work. And you know, speaking here today with all of you within the context of framing, I of course consider my frames. I mean, they effectively are, but I also think that they are sculptures with it in their own right. And so sometimes I even hesitate to refer to them as frames, especially as you know, I've gotten more and more sucked into this process of sculpture, and it's really just sort of taken over my life. And now it's this constant push and pull between the two dimensions, between sculpture and painting, because I think, you know, as humans, we like to categorize things. This is a painting, this is a frame, this is a sculpture. But for me, they have really started to blend together, and they feel like two sides of one coin at this point. And so yeah, you can see how like the cabbage, those shoes, like these forms are sort of starting to like reach off the wall and become more sculptural. And then I started really making actual freestanding sculpture that always had painting embedded in it, and it was you know, always coming back to that. But yeah, the frame is, you know, the impetus behind the entire work. And this was a piece that I made in 2021, and it was shown at the Armory show in New York, and then collected into a museum collection in Beijing. And yeah, so this was a pivotal piece for me. This was a moment where, yeah, the sculptural aspect of my work really took off. And this work is, it's quite large. It's about this big, and yeah, I was working within the bounds that I had at the time, which, you know, I had bought my own ceramic kiln, which was a barrel kiln, not too big, and I was really just making things as big as I possibly could within that space. And yeah, I mean, we're speaking mostly about the frames. There's many ways I like to speak about my work, but yeah, the subject matter, the imagery that I'm often drawn to, is kind of like trying to offer, you know, a counter to the literal interpretation of the world. I'm really interested in dreams, in psychoanalysis, in these symbols that we surround ourselves with. So I often depict, you know, quotidian objects, food, things that we have this like really personal connection to, and then I try to sort of reinterpret them and make them uncanny and strange. And that too is it's a reframing of the concepts behind the work. So I think that idea of framing permeates both, you know, the physical side of my work, but also conceptually. And then the work started getting even larger. So this piece is quite large. It's maybe 5 times the size of the screen, and it's framed also in ceramic. Ceramic strawberries. And there's something about repetition that I keep coming back to. There's sort of this like meditative, transcendental quality to repeating something again and again, all meticulously handmade. Yeah, all my ceramic is made by hand. I don't really use any mold making practices or anything like that. It's all, I'm a very tactile person, and I think that that's why the medium lent itself so well to me, because so many other sculptural practices, you know, you like woodworking, metal, all these other things, you need specialized tools, and there's like so much mediation between you and the material, whereas ceramic is so immediate, yet transformative. And yeah, so I wanted to walk you through the process a little bit. So starting with the frame, it starts with a very crude sketch, you know, something just off the top of my head. I get a lot of ideas through dreams, through just the world around me, things that I encounter. And so once the idea is there, I just need to jot it down and get it in on paper. And I also have a couple of assistants that work with me. So that's also about translating my ideas to them so that they can then help execute the work for me. And then it's all just sculpted by hand. So you can see here this big horse frame that I'm going to make, again, around a rectangular canvas. But yeah, so I start just sculpting from raw clay, and that process takes a lot of time. It's very time, yeah, time. It sucks all my time up, and there's a battle with the medium because I'm trying to keep it moist enough to work with, but not too moist so that it collapses. And it's an additive process, a subtractive process. And then once I'm happy with it, it goes into the kiln for a first firing, which is called a bisque firing. And that just sort of hardens up the material so that I can then go and glaze it. And so the image on the far side there is of the horse head getting glazed, and yeah, so I make a lot of my own glazes myself, so I'm very involved in every aspect of the process, and then that gets fired again, sometimes multiple times, and then I will put it around the canvas, and then I'm really responding to the qualities of the ceramic, whatever emerges through that process. And this work was for an exhibition which I had in Brussels in 2023, and yeah, the show was sort of about these, moments of majesty and intensity, which is what I felt that the horse really brought forth, contrasted by these sort of like smaller, intimate moments of human emotion. So there were a lot of gridding in the show, cropped images that I was painting in oil, and then there's a whole logistical aspect to making these large scale frames because you're countering gravity, and I'm trying to hang something really heavy on the wall. So the image on the other side here, you can see there's a metal armature that the sculpture is hanging off of. And that's really been an innovative process for me. It's a feat of engineering sometimes. I have metal people that I'll work with who will help me kind of figure out how these things can physically hang on the wall. And this is the finished work. And so it's quite three-dimensional. It really stretches forward. And this was another further step for me, just trying to, really push the boundaries of what sculpture could be, what framing could be, what painting is really at the end of the day. And here are some images of the exhibition. And I love this side view because you can really see how much it's reaching off of the wall. And then there's a sense of strangeness with it too, because you're seeing the horse almost from the underside. And I spent so much time studying paintings of horses, images of horses. Horses appear so much in art history, which is something that I was interested in as well. And yeah, this exhibition, each of the works was kind of a universe in and of itself, though they all had this sort of through line through them, and always painting and sculpture interplaying with each other, always painting and the frame, and almost always the sculpture comes first. So then it's really just this process, this stream of consciousness process of trying to uncover, what this piece really wants to be. And yeah, here are some more images from the exhibition. This one at the front here was a knife block that I sculpted in clay, and then these sort of domestic objects kind of intercut through it. And there was this large scale piece that I made, which was a series of 12 ceramic plates that were all handmade and hand glazed. And then each one had a circular painting in it of a scene of professional wrestling. And it was, yeah, again, this sort of like quotidian thing that we encounter so often, like a plate of food, but made sort of strange with these fish parts. And then these moments of like tension and high impact intercut with it. And yeah. And yeah, another view from the show. And also, so I work so much with found imagery, so that's where I'm sourcing everything that I'm painting. And also for my sculptural references, it just comes from a lot of different places. Personal photographs, I'm on eBay all the time sourcing stuff. I go to the library, used bookstores. Anything that's kind of in the cultural consciousness is interesting to me because I think that these symbols, they permeate our psychology, and every person kind of has a different reaction to them, which is always interesting to me as well. And so since I'm working so much with found imagery for this exhibition, I also made some sculptures just in their own right. These little fire poker sculptures, where I used found object in tandem with the found imagery and cut them apart and then added ceramic components. So yeah, this journey has kind of led me into sculpture in and of itself as well. And okay, so then after that exhibition, which was a successful exhibition for me, it enabled me to buy a huge industrial scale ceramic kiln, which was a very exciting moment and really allowed me to then expand my work even further. And so the first exhibition that I did with this big kiln, with these huge facilities at my fingertips, was an exhibition that I had in Montreal in 2024, where my studio's in Brooklyn, and I'm sort of surrounded by all of this like detritus and trash and just discarded items. And again, just pulling from my environment, these tires that are just strewn around this industrial part of Brooklyn really interested me. And so I found a few tires, brought them back to the studio, and then made molds of them. And then I ended up casting 39 ceramic tires, which then acted as the frames for my paintings. Some of them were on the wall, and then there were groupings of them that existed as sculptures. And there's paintings embedded in them. There's other little objects that are sculpted, and like bits of trash, discarded food items, like little personal trinkets as well. And there were wall works that also all had ceramic frames. Here are some more images from the exhibition. And I was thinking about the idea of context, the constraint between chaos and freedom that really defines my work. And so for this exhibition, I also wanted to intervene in the architecture of the space as well. So the show, I painted all the walls this pale blue to kind of like pull it all together and make it really feel like you're entering into a whole new environment. Yeah, here's another one, which you can see a little bit closer, some of the paintings. And the larger piece on the wall in the back also has these big ceramic tin cans that I sculpted, also interacting with the idea of detritus and trash. But within the tin cans, these little octopus tentacles emerge. And yeah, that was quite a feat, that piece. Yeah, another exhibition view from that show. And yeah, so I was really getting a lot larger scale. The work on the side, the giant picnic blanket, was the absolute interior of my kiln. So I was really pushing it as far as I could and trying to make large scale work. And the interesting thing about ceramic too for me is that it is such a delicate medium, and I think people kind of walk around it on tippy toes, and it has this air of being fragile and impermanent, but it has so much weight to it and so much presence to it. And there's a sense of power for me, like hanging these large things on the wall, making these large scale sculptures, and but always coming back to painting. That's something that's really defined my work, is that it's really this push and pull between the two. This work was, so as a self-taught ceramic artist, I've always just made things with my hands. I've always just, hand built everything. But I was starting to think about the history of ceramic as well. And that really led me to the idea of tiles and tile making. Same with those fish plates. That was also sort of an interaction with like functional ceramic. But this work at the back, where the figure is standing next to it, that was a whole tiled panel that I sort of thought of as a window into the canvas. And that's often how I think about my frames as well, is that they're this window into the canvas, and then they interact with it and gird it in this really particular way. So yeah. And now, so after I had done that large scale installation, I started thinking about my work kind of as being split in two. A lot of my pieces are large scale painting with ceramic framing it, but then I started making these works that were sort of sculpture in and of themselves, always with painting embedded. But I sort of started feeling that there was this divide between the two types of work. So on one hand, the ceramic is the frame, and on the other hand, the ceramic is sort of this object that has a presence in and of itself. And I'm sort of trying to bring two states of mind together into one object. And yeah, another example of that. So this was a very recent work, this ceramic suitcase with the painting inset in the back. And with this one and like a series that I was working on around that time, I was really trying to bring the painting into the sculpture and the sculpture into the painting. So my glaze application is quite painterly, and the canvases are really, you know, morphing to fit inside the sculpture. And yeah, another example of that. This one, so like I said, often my work it starts with the frame, and then I'm really responding to that. But with this work, I don't like to have any sort of hard and fast rules within my practice. Like I really am after this sense of freedom. So with this work, I was working on the two in tandem. I wanted the painting to feel like it was spilling out into the ceramic, and really like, you know, playing with that idea of dimensionality, playing with that idea of the two being separate or part of one whole. And yeah, however, in contrast to the other piece, which is more of just a small sculptural work with a little painting in it. And yeah, and then that culminated in my next large piece, which was for an exhibition that I did in Shanghai last year. And this show was entitled Corridors, and it was sort of about like reimagining the spaces that we live inside of. And so I was looking at you know, my small apartment downtown with my rental with these, you know, kind of cheap appliances, and how they kind of permeate. There was a sense of nostalgia to it. There was a sense of like my own childhood, something that I was drawing on quite heavily. And so I decided to make a full-size ceramic oven that would then house various paintings. And so this was a whole feat to sculpt. It's quite large, quite heavy, and there's all kinds of relief work in the back. On top of the stove sits a ceramic frying pan with flowers and lobster, and there's this real sense of surrealism in it. And then the front panel has an inset for a painting where, you know, the window would be, and then the side I cut out a piece of the ceramic to house another painting. And with this one, I wanted it to feel, you know, it's sort of whimsical, and there's this sort of sense of wonder with it. But then inside are these coiled up snakes, the sense of pathos, something maybe a little bit foreboding. And some other works in the exhibition were these two. And so at this point, like the sculpture is really taking on a life of its own. And like I said, I hesitate to even really call them frames at this point because they are so sculptural, and the canvases are really being cramped into them, you know? So this one, the dollhouse on the side, the paintings all kind of like move with the undulating sides of the ceramic. And same with the large grandfather clock that's over 7 feet tall and has 3 paintings in it. And then this is another work that I finished at the end of last year, and it was a freestanding sculpture that had 7 paintings embedded in various rooms. And again, the idea of, you know, the house has eyes, like what are the memories that are encoded in the home? And each of the images are kind of like various symbols that sort of, you know, permeate from like the natural world to, you know, crops of hands, and the house sort of like becoming and transforming. And these are 2 recent works as well, where the one on the blue one here is the ceramic really is starting to like encroach into the painting as well. The little dotted enamelware kind of texture of the ceramic then I'm taking that in and painting that in oil as well. And yeah, and now I'm sort of at this interesting juncture in my work. Like it was mentioned earlier that I just spent 2 weeks in the Arctic at the North Pole sailing on a barquentine tall ship. And so prior to that, I had sort of taken the last couple of months to just slow down a little bit and try some new stuff in my studio, change my process a little bit. And this was such a transformative experience for me, being up in the far north, that now I'm back in the studio and I'm thinking about, what's going to come next. And it's always this push and pull between painting, between the object and two dimension. And yeah, these are some more process images of, where the pieces come from. And so we'll see what's next. I have a big exhibition coming up in January in New York. So I'm going to start working on that next week, probably. And yeah, I'm excited to see how it all unfolds. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. This was terrific. I have to say, it is 2025, which means that it was 40 years ago that I met Eli Wilner. I had been framing for about 8 years, and period frames were not even in my consciousness. And I had the good fortune to meet Eli when he was just getting started, and he really revolutionized the awareness of the period frame, and specifically American frames of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I was able to go on that journey with him, and we pioneered so much early history about picture frames. And it's really gratifying to me that I find picture frames as exciting and interesting and compelling today as I did 40 years ago when I met Eli. And this has led, as you may have read, to my forthcoming Stettheimer picture frames coming out in July. Hallelujah. So I'm very excited about that. But to the questions at hand, we promised you something different, right? And so, Jenny, I have a question for you. We know that Chevrolet's color theory was influencing the artists, and there were a lot of those frames, and yet so few of them seem to survive. And I wondered, was it because it was too radical? Was it because Chevrolet's theories didn't really hold up, that maybe white or green or red was not the perfect complement for certain pictures? Or was it also the patrons or the collectors or the dealers' compulsion to keep their hold on the past and the gilded object?
It's a great question. I mean, there are very few that survive, and part of owning a picture sometimes reframing it can be your way of putting a mark on it. I think for some of the Impressionist frames that do survive seem very close to architectural moldings, and I wonder, I'm not a frame expert in the way that there are other frame experts, people who spend a lot of time thinking about how they're constructed in this room. But I suspect that some of the Impressionist frames were actually just being sort of run off rather quickly for the sake of the exhibition and for the sake of creating an environment the artists were seeking. So I wonder how well they would have held up. And then it also meant that it had to fit into your interior. I will say that one person in the Mary Cassatt exhibition commented that the green frame on the Mary Cassatt looked like a bedroom frame, whereas the gold frame looked like it belonged to the living room. And I'll leave.
Yes. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. I was wondering if it was a more impermanent sense that the object had that accounts for fewer of them existing, that you have a more worked object with a gilded frame. And just as a thought, the evanescence of the object, not the seriousness of the intent.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, and also the frame is many things, but it is context. for sure. And I always like to call up Durand Ruel as an example. He was used to selling paintings of Fragonard and Boucher. And if you have this radical new kind of art, a la Impressionism, put that in a context, i.e. a picture frame, that is accessible and familiar. So it's interesting, all the many roles that those will fill. On that note, Tracy, and also an extension of an observation I made where we have these juxtaposed images of the two Cassatt frames, it wasn't just gold leaf versus green. It was a profound change in the structure, the contours of the frame. The green frame is a much simpler, spare frame as opposed to an elaborate frame, to elaborate Louis frame. And so, Tracy, building on your talk, knowing how the Prendergasts were not copying the predecessors, but being inspired by them and interpreting them that way, but also how Murphy, I keep looking at this particular frame right here. This is one of an infinite number of variations of the cassetta molding, which Murphy more or less brought back from his travels, and that became the frame that you put on early 20th century American pictures. And that was a really spare, stripped down interpretation of what had come before in the 19th century. And then leading on to modernist frames, which were even more spare. But that's a very long way of asking, how do you see that the arts and crafts movement and the veneration of craft as real artistry, how that played a role for the perception of the frame as something more than just a container?
It's a big question. I did actually want to go back to what you were talking about with Jenny here, that I don't think that keeping gold frames meant keeping hold of the past. I think a lot of times when frames came for exhibit or came here, we talked about how Mrs. Havermeyer had Degas, an original Degas frame with a white panel and a simple gold reeded outside. When it came here for exhibit at, I think, the National Academy, they made her gild the panel. They said they couldn't have a white frame on the wall. So I think sometimes exhibits had to be consistent. Getting back to what you said, the cassetta, it means little box, right? So it is a container. So, you have all the organic ornament pushed to the outside, or in this case, to the corners. It's the precursor, I think. It acts almost as a mat. It's a protective surround. But I wish I'd had time to talk more about color on frames, which would have tied in with yours and yours as well. Because it wasn't just that the Prendergasts were like coloring with paint. Charles is doing it kind of a folk arty sort of way. But when you get further into the 20th century, skipping over arts and crafts, but moving forward, where the colorations get darker, they get metal leaf, and then they become painted surfaces, and comb gesso and scumbled gesso rubbed onto frames, and wormy chestnut frames. The whole evolution of gold into color and what artists want is some subject for another conference.
Oh, about
really,
four more.
Yeah, really interesting. I don't know if I answered your question, but the flatness of the cassetta, I think, actually started probably in the late 1880s, 1890s with Stanford White and the architectural aspect of frame design. But he was only making frames for specific artist friends, and they were designed to be flat to the wall with interiors, but they were still being made by cabinet makers.
Yes.
And the people who did his, the ceiling ornaments at the Metropolitan Club, or Joseph Cabus, who was a cabinet maker, he'd say, carve me a frame. So it wasn't, that's why I picked Prendergast as the transition to artists really being able to make their own frames and think about how they wanted them to be for themselves. So
That makes sense. Absolutely. And the little bit that I wrote as my précis, which I would just invite you to read, is just about the many different roles that a picture frame holds and how many ways there are to think about it and its roles in architecture and object and surround. Left turn, Stephanie. I love what you're doing. This was inspired in part. There's a terrific article that came out in ArtNet by Katie White, And it's all about how contemporary artists are embracing the frame and making art that the frame actually becomes part and parcel of the art. And I think your work is a great example of that. But one of the points she brought out that I thought was fascinating is, and I would ask you if you think this is true of your work, is this embrace of the three dimensions of a reaction to this flat screen world that we're living in, or as Katie so well put it, is it a rebuttal to the super flat virtual age?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think it's, these days, so much art that we look at and consume is through our phone screens or through the computer. And it's easy to forget that artworks have a real presence and have an aura about them that you really need to be standing in front of it to experience. And I think for me, that was also one of the reasons why I wanted the painting to reach off the wall and to become three-dimensional. It just, even just seeing the images here that I was showing, that the works have such a different presence in person. And that's true of all painting or all artwork, of course. But I think something about really defining the three-dimensionality of it, or the sculptural nature of my work, or any frame for that matter, just puts an emphasis on the fact that we need to get off of our screens and we need to see things in person and move around them. And yeah, so for me, it's really exhilarating to be in the studio and like really be with the presence of the works.
Amen.
Yeah.
And thank you. Your admonishment coming off of 3 weeks in the Arctic with no connectivity.
I was off grid. It was so nice.
Yeah. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yes, Jacqueline.
Hi, thanks for the panel. I had a question if there was any documentation of the response to Degas' green frames.
That's a good question. I mean, there's certainly, the reviewers commented on it. I don't think they were quite as harsh about his frames as they were with Cassatt. She is one of the first to come out with the colored frames. So he initially is with just the white ones.
You want to, Tracy?
We have I think it's a Pizarro frame in our galleries, the Degas designs made by Cluzel, his maker, oak. And it is painted with what the critics at the time were criticizing his frames being in shades of peach and Veronese green. So I have to have the paint tested on this frame to see if it is original that he or Degas painted it. But there was that criticism in answer to your question. No. I think it's in Isabel Kahn in her book. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you know whether, because a lot of the times these frames, like colored frames or white frames, were also matte. There was a sort of conversation around the matteness of the paint surface. So I was wondering, you mentioned that the conservators had removed varnish. Do you know if Marie Cassatt was that original varnish, or how close to the painting was of that painting, the production of that painting, was it varnished? Because sometimes dealers would also, especially Durand Ruel, would be advised by artists like Pissarro, please don't varnish my paintings. If you do, varnish it in something clear, not something tinted with yellow or bitumen. And would also say, request sort of to have some kind of agency over the framing as well, because Durand Ruel would often immediately reframe and varnish.
So we found in our research into Cassatt that really from when she joined the Impressionists onward, we don't think she was varnishing. And we know that partly because we took some of the paintings out of the frames and discovered that they had been varnished in their frames. Because when you sort of pull them out, the edges of the canvases were not varnished. And certainly having a more matte surface is something that we know that Pissarro felt very, very strongly about it. So part of what we had done in preparation for our exhibition was to remove the varnish from all Cassatt paintings from about 1878, 79 onward. So we have retained varnish on 2 of them because they're of that earlier moment, and we found that the surfaces were so much richer. They actually held a lot of sort of pigment and medium, so they didn't feel dry. That she really had worked them up in a way that they don't need the varnish to provide that kind of saturation.
Settling might have been about curing a bit and sort of letting people know, look, it's going to not going to be as garish as it's still safe to buy.
But it is also a reminder that, you know, these pictures and the frames all have afterlives. So we always have to be mindful, even with frames get, you know, repainted and resurfaced, and people, you know, add shellac to them and the like too. So it's always a reminder to look really carefully and to, you know, we may not be seeing things in the same condition that they were in.
To this point, and to what you were talking about, screens and things, I am personally really against glazing oil paintings. And I know it's a big controversy. I know Marty has strong feelings about this, but it takes away from the painter's texture and the feeling of the original paint. I know there's conservation issues, but I feel like glazing in oil makes us look at it like a flat TV screen. And we don't, I got to stand in front of Van Gogh in Madrid in an empty gallery and just absorb the paint. It was amazing. And you don't get that when things travel.
It's interesting. I'm a conservator. I'm also largely against glazing, even though it's
The world we live in, unfortunately. The world we live in, unfortunately, a
It
protective
also
issue.
it pushes the frame further forward away from the canvas, which creates different shadows. So the relationship between painting and frame also
Absolutely.
changes considerably.
what's also interesting is that some of the early impressionists, so Pissarro was one of the first artists to recommend glazing because the options were either the collector or the dealer is going to guard my painting, or I say, look, please glaze my painting. So some of the earliest impressionist paintings were originally glazed. Their original frames were glazed.
I didn't know that.
That's interesting. We could have this conversation all afternoon, and I know there are other speakers who are waiting their turn. So please approach all of us on break, and don't miss on the far side of this pillar a super charming original artist frame on the painting by Ernie Barnes, the comedian. It's super charming and really unassuming. Thank you very much. Okay, everybody.